This podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to provide medical advice. It exists only to entertain. Alba. You gotta listen, you don't have to read. Welcome, everyone. This is Poor Historians, a podcast misadventuring into the archives of medical history and beyond. I'm Dr. Max, and I'm joined here by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Aaron. Hello, sir.
How's it going?
It is going well, and I got to say that the two of us will be flying solo together. If I don't know if that phrasing is a thing.
Does that work?
I don't know.
We're together solo.
We are solo together.
It's because Mike is such a big absence. It feels like we're alone, even though we're both here.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. I guess we'll be nice to Mike. But we are together on this episode by ourselves. No Alba as well, I'm sorry to say. But that is just because we're bringing you a special interview with a special guest talking about a fascinating topic. When you out there think of a surgeon, or rather your impression of what makes up the surgeon's persona, what comes to mind? Think of the surgeons portrayed on TV or those in fiction. What about the real people who do surgery, if you've met them or been a patient of theirs? There's still a mythos of sorts that surrounds them. And today we'll be speaking with author Agnes Arnold-Forster about her book, Cold Hard Steel, The Myth of the Modern Surgeon. And we'll get to that in just a few moments. But before we do so, we will bring you a few words about our sponsor, Artery Inc., as well as some more discussion of Mike's Trivia Challenge giveaway, Mike's Trivia Challenge giveaway. Articles are difficult.
I see what you did there.
This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Artery Inc. So this is a special time of year, not only because it's October, which is obviously the best month, but because Artery Inc. is doing a giveaway for one of our lucky fans. From now through the end of November, for any listener that sends us a question for Mike's Trivia Challenge, that's where you send us a question that we ask Mike when he has no preparation, something having to do with medical history, and see if he knows the answer, which so far he hasn't gotten one completely right. Well, you send us that question, and if you do that, you will be entered into a giveaway. So Artery Inc. is offering to give away a t-shirt as well as a coloring book to the winner of that contest. There will be a few more details to check out. We'll have them in the show notes or on our website, so go there before you submit us a question, and we'll have information as to how to get us those questions as well. This would also be a great time to go over to www.arteryinc.com, that's INK, to check out their selection of those anatomy-inspired t-shirts and artistic apparel, and check out the coloring book as well. Their designs are completely original, and the company itself does a lot of good in the community and in the world, so it's really worth shopping there anyway. And if you do choose to shop there, please use the promo code HISTORYPOD, all one word, to save 10% on all orders over $35. It shows some love for the show, some love for the company, and please note that promo code does not apply to subscription boxes. About time we get back to the show. We are back here with our guest, Dr. Agnes Arnold-Forster, author of Cold Hard Steel, The Myth of the Modern Surgeon, joined all the way from across the pond, as we have been before. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very well, thank you.
Well, really appreciate you being here, and really appreciated your book for a couple of different reasons. Not only the topic being fascinating, but it's a little bit of a twist for us, because usually we have had books or topics that are kind of a concise person or a concise illness or maybe even an invention in medical history. But I think when I saw your book come across, I think the thing that really caught me was that we're talking about, as the subtitle says, the myth of the modern surgeon. And this is not one person. This is sort of a persona, an entity. And I just thought that was a really cool, different topic, because it is something that certainly Aaron and I as emergency physicians run into a lot, but there's also kind of a popular perception and, in media, in those sort of things about but what is a surgeon and how should they act? How should they be in society? And I think there's a lot of complexity that goes into that character, if you will. And, enough complexity certainly to have an entire book about it. And this was a great and fascinating read. So I do appreciate that. Starting with just kind of what it's about, can you tell us a little bit, how did How did you come across this idea? What made you take on the myth of the modern surgeon?
So I was working on a project called Surgery and Emotion, which is a big Wellcome Trust funded project here in the UK. And I was tasked with researching the modern and contemporary surgeon, so roughly from the Second World War onwards. And my main thing that I was doing as part of that project was interviewing current and recently retired surgeons. And the project, as it sort of sounds, was about emotions. So, as you say, not really about the history of surgery in the conventional sense, right? It's not about new technique or technology. It's not about a specific surgeon. It's about surgery more broadly. And I think the thing that was innovative about this project, and the thing that I've been trying to do, is to write a history of the kind of rank and file surgeon, the kind of everyday surgeon, and also the invented surgeon or the mythical surgeon. And so I was interviewing all these surgeons, and we were talking about their feelings. And I really expected that these conversations would be about the high feelings of surgery, the kind of dramas of surgery that we might be more familiar with as members of the laity, as it were. So the grief of patient loss, the sort of the casualty, the Grey's Anatomy feelings, those kinds of emotions. And there was definitely some of that. There was definitely surgeons talking about incredibly moving cases or dramatic episodes or experiences. But the vast majority of what people wanted to talk to me about, and it was very unstructured in these interviews, they're very free flow. I kind of go with what the person I'm talking to wants to discuss. The thing they wanted to talk about was the kind of really quite mundane feelings of being a doctor and being a surgeon specifically, but also just working in healthcare more generally, like tedium, frustration, the boredom of doing paperwork, but also a kind of feeling of like, antagonism with colleagues or frustration with electronic systems, all these things that kind of make up the bread and butter of day-to-day life. And so I started thinking, okay, well, that's a book that hasn't been written, or that's a kind of subject that hasn't really been explored in very much detail. And so I started researching it, started looking at it more historically, using these interviews, but also looking at other kinds of source materials. And it really struck me that it's not just the thing about being a surgeon, or the feelings are associated with being a surgeon, are not just those sort of day-to-day tediums, frustrations, boredoms, whatever. But there's also the sense that surgeons feel like they ought to be something, or be a certain way, or adhere to a certain model. And that can attract people into the profession. That's some of the things that some medical students I spoke to were like, oh, well, I want to be a surgeon because I admire that kind of persona, or that myth is alluring to me. But there were also people who were really put off surgery for some of its myths and associations and reputations. And talking to the book's not really about patients, or it's about the general public as a kind of, as you say, their visions of what surgery ought to be. But, this idea that surgeons, there's a kind of quite powerful and pervasive ideal of what a surgeon is. And that was the thing that really drew me in and started the thing that I started writing about and thinking about in a lot more depth.
Well, and I would say, again, as somebody who works with surgeons, we see a lot of those types of personalities. There's not one type of surgeon, and I think not only the ones that we work with, but a lot of the surgeons that we read about. We've done episodes on, most recently Dr. Percival Pott, and then Dr. Joseph Lister. And when you read about their personalities, they seem like two very different types of people, but they're still above all of that seems to be this idea of, especially when we're diving, we tend to end up a lot in Victorian times, and there is sort of this general thought of a severe, surly, but almost godly, godlike surgeon that was infallible and just really holding life and death in the balance. And there's something to a lot of that, but not every surgeon filled that role out. And so it was really cool because your book does, although a lot of it does take place, as you said, around the earlier part of the 20th century and going forward, there are still some of those roots. And, where did all of these people, where did this idea start? And I think one of the fun things is that when you towards the beginning of your book, we're talking about the public perception. So we may think, as we're doing this history podcast of surgeons, or where the idea of what a surgeon is starting back in Victorian times, but it was kind of cool to see the evolution of what the public might perceive a surgeon to be like through some of the popular things. And you do mention things like Grey's Anatomy, but you also mention a lot of shows that were way before that, some of which I'd heard of, some of which I hadn't. And I wondered if we can talk a little bit about there and kind of say, we can't maybe summarize it in one phrase, but do you have just kind of a overview for the listener of what was the popular perception, perhaps, of a surgeon maybe in the earlier 20th century as it evolved to Grey's Anatomy?
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, this vision we have of the surgeon is forged in the early 19th century, and I've got lots of very smart colleagues who've worked on that period of surgery's history. But yeah, as I kind of really pick up the story in the early 20th century, and also with the emergence of television and popular films, which is post-war kind of phenomenon, and by that point, there's quite a solid caricature, I suppose, of the surgeon that already exists. And that caricature is made and maintained by programs and books like Doctor in the House with Sir Lancelot Spratt. And in the UK, if you speak to a perhaps more senior surgeon or an older surgeon, they will definitely have heard of Sir Lancelot Spratt. Younger surgeons less so, but he was a towering figure in the kind of 1950s, 60s fictional scene. He is the quintessential paternalistic, authoritarian, brash, bombastic, male, macho kind of surgeon who sort of strode the wards, sparking at patients and at his students. And he really, I think, typifies or exemplifies exactly the kind of surgical myth that I'm toying with. So he didn't create that myth, but he embodies it, I think, most fully. And you see permutations of him in all sorts of other bits of popular culture around this time. So there's a very the kind of the first carbolic soap opera, as they were called. So soap operas.
My favorite subtitle of genre.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? For those that don't know, carbolic soap was used a lot in medical settings and has a very astringent, particular smell, and it's sort of a soap opera set in a healthcare setting. And so Emergency Ward 10, which was pretty much a soap opera, right, with against the backdrop of a hospital, and has love affairs and intrigue and all those sorts of things. And that had lots of those kinds of surgeons, those sorts of Lancelot Spratt surgeon figures. Romance fiction is another thing that I write a lot about in the book and elsewhere as well. And that also, so Mills and Boon, Harlequin novels, they have these romantic heroes, these granite-jawed, emotionless male heroes who are the love interests and they're surgeons. But I think it's also important to point out that for all of these caricatures, these very kind of simplistic portrayals of surgeons, even in the 1950s, there's still some subtlety to it. There's still some nuance to it. There are some who buck the trend. There are some who are, you can't really fall in love with a surgeon who's got absolutely no emotion, because then, what do you fall in love with? So there needs to be some sort of softening to those edges. And in the same way, there were also female surgeons in these early fictional examples. And obviously although in some ways they adhere to those caricatures because they have to in order to succeed in what is an incredibly male-dominated world at that time, and to an extent still today. But they also obviously embody different traits, and they kind of round out this sort of myth in a slightly different way. And so while these caricatures are very powerful, even from their very inception, they're always kind of flecked through with something a bit different. There's never something totally straightforward. As you say, there are lots of different ways to be a surgeon, and there are lots of different surgeons out there. And one of the things that's interesting is seeing how and to what extent different characters adhere or don't adhere to these stereotypes.
Yeah, I would assume once you've started looking into this, you can't stop seeing it. And it must be interesting to watch the way it's changed more recently. I mean, Grey's Anatomy has a wide variety of, which you talk about a little bit, a wide variety of plays on the caricature, right? So there's some that are sort of, I don't know, Dr. McDreamy is an extension of the old stereotype, but then there's a lot of other characters. How do you feel like it's changed more recently? Do you feel like it's still perpetuating the same sort of stereotype, or have you seen it change as society has changed? Or
I mean, I would have liked to write alone more about Grey's Anatomy. I have a lot more to to say about Grey's Anatomy, but it's a British book, unfortunately, so there's only so, I had to draw the line somewhere. But I think it's true that it has changed, and I think that it has changed very dramatically in some ways, and then also not at all in others. So I think this idea of the emotionless or the emotionally detached surgeon, I think, is still the dominant caricature, the sort of dominant trait or kind of personality type that pervades society, popular culture, and you see it in Grey's Anatomy all the time. They talk about it constantly. I mean, I'm a devotee. I've seen all the seasons multiple times, and they constantly come back to this tension, which is, how much emotion should I invest in my patients or in the case? There's always this kind of debate, and some of the main story arcs are when surgeons give too much to their patients, and that's always seen as a failing, as a fault. In early seasons, I don't know how familiar people are going to be, but Izzy Stevens falls in love. He's one of the surgeons, one of the interns. She falls in love with one of her patients, and sorry for spoiling a 20-year-old program, he dies through her.
We'll put an alert.
We'll put a warning. We'll put a warning. Yeah.
He dies through her overzealous intervention, and an attempt to save his life, but it doesn't work. And that is seen as a kind of ultimate failing, but then also always kind of comes back to showing or an example of her fundamental humanity. So there's a kind of, but you can't have those plays with that tension if you don't have the stereotype to begin with. If you don't have this kind of well accepted idea that surgeons are emotionally attached, then you can't toy with that as a narrative force. But I think the thing that has changed is that now surgeons are self-identifying almost as more emotional. So you see this at the end of the book. I write a bit about surgical memoirs. So surgeons, particularly kind of prominent senior ones, writing autobiographies, crafting these very different, much more emotionally attuned, sensitive personas and characters. And I say personas not to say that I think they're lying or being inauthentic, but there's always a certain degree of you're always narrativizing your own life in that way. You're always trying to put yourself across in a certain guise, and I think that that's partly because the cultural capital of being emotional has increased. So now it is much more socially acceptable to be emotionally invested in all sorts of things or to express your feelings. And I think that if you want to sell books, you have to pull on people's heartstrings. And so there are lots of different, again, I maybe sound really cynical, but I do think there are some sort of quasi-cynical reasons for why people articulate themselves and their professional identities in these ways.
Yeah. Okay, there's like 15 things to unpack there. I mean, what I love is the book unpacks all those threads and the tensions between the caricature and the people in a really fascinating way on multiple levels. And I loved it for that because it took seriously a lot of those tensions. It resonated a lot, the cultural capital especially. I mean, I think all of us in medicine absolutely create and craft a persona for a purpose. And there's multiple purposes to protect ourselves, but also to provide comfort and also to interact with patients. That's what we do. So, it's a really interesting sort of tension. I guess from that, it's interesting that we hold on to things that might initially seem harmful. So as there's been this shift from this persona that's kind of cold and unfeeling towards one, I mean, a lot of surgeons, and I think medicine in general, we've held on to this idea that, oh no, we're capable of working 120 hours a week and we are different from other professions and we don't need breaks and so on. And we have, as a profession, held on to that. And you do speak about that quite a bit, I think. Is that something that you saw in the interviews? And do you have a sense of some of the reasons why we're continuing to harm ourselves that way?
I mean, it's a great question. And one that, is slightly baffling to me as someone who's a kind of outsider, for want of a better word. I mean, I think that the stuff I wrote about working time and the kind of intense temporal commitment that surgery and other medical professions require in some ways the most controversial bit of the book, which I didn't anticipate. I didn't think that people would mind so much me writing critically about how many hours surgeons worked. But some people really feel very passionately that it is the thing that makes them surgeons, is that you cannot be a surgeon without those hours. You cannot be a surgeon if you aren't working 80, 100, 120-hour weeks. And in the UK and the US also, they're different, right? So that it used to be that the UK also, surgeons worked 120-hour weeks. Since the late 90s, we've had EU legislation that's restrict the working week for all professions, but including healthcare professionals. And a lot of people I spoke to see that as a great tragedy and see that as a decline in just the professional standards of surgery. And this also obviously applies to other medical professions, but I'm just going to talk about surgery because it's the thing I talk about. But yeah, so that's a decline in the professional standards of surgery, but it's also a decline or an erosion of what it means to be a surgeon. That the thing, the sort of the time in the trenches, the kind of self-sacrifice, the kind of torturous experiences of fatigue, sleeplessness, all of the things that sound really miserable are the things that make you a surgeon. And also the sort of idea that I'm more sympathetic to, I suppose, that you need that time in the operating theatre, that it's a skill that is acquired by apprenticeship effectively still, and it's that you have to do a lot of surgery to be good at surgery. So that makes sense to me. And so you can't acquire the amount of surgery that you need to be a good surgeon without these really excessive working times. But I think that, I don't necessarily, I think there's lots of evidence. This isn't really the subject of my book, so there's lots, as a historian, it's not really up to me to proclaim whether I think it's a good idea or not. Personally, I don't think you need to be working 120-hour weeks to be a good doctor. But that's for other people to debate. I'll wade in if that's what you want to do. But generally speaking, I think it's a very problematic set of expectations and standards. I think it is a good thing that we have limited the working week in the UK, and I think the US should follow suit. But partly because I don't think you need that sort of level of self-sacrifice to be a good doctor, but also because it's exclusionary. It doesn't allow for people with caring responsibilities, different models of life. It is one of the things that has made surgery remain very male-dominated, and it is a barrier in lots of ways. And I also think, surely, and again, this is me as a historian with my limited evidence base, surely being really, really tired doesn't make you a great surgeon. I would be slightly concerned if I was if I was being operated on by someone who'd been awake for 3 days or whatever. But what am I? Who am I to judge? But I think the thing that is interesting to me, and the thing that I kind of come back to over and over again in the book, is if these things are damaging, if they are harmful, why are people so attached to them? Why is this such a topic of controversy? And I think that if it was that these were straightforwardly bad things, or straightforwardly bad characteristics, say the sort of intense self-sacrifice, the ability to work under intense duress, if they were just bad things, then they would have been discarded because they wouldn't be of any use to anyone. But obviously they are important. They're important for those reasons, the sort of more practical reasons, like it allows people to have a lot of time in the operating theatre. It allows people to learn a lot on the job. But it's also important because clearly it gives people a sense, well, I think, and from my interviews anyway, it gave people and gives people a profound sense of belonging and commitment and meaning to their work. I don't think that's the only way that you can get those things in the world of medicine, but I think it has been incredibly important for people's sense of, this is something that I've committed wholeheartedly to, and there have to be benefits to, seeing the same people day in, day out. You're living in these incredibly intense environments. You form bonds that you might not otherwise. It's collegial. It's a community. Up until relatively recently, a lot of people in the UK, if they were trained to be doctors, would live on hospital site with other healthcare professionals. And so you have this sort of intense full-time nature of your job, which allows you to fully embody and identify with that job. And because the job is often very hard and demoralizing and difficult, you have patients who die, you have all the frustrating electronic systems, you have printers that don't work. You have, you know, fax machines in the NHS that don't work. You know, all of those things are
And they don't
annoying and
work over here
frustrating.
either, just so you know.
Yeah.
We have
I
trouble with faxes as well. It's
yeah,
not.
I feel like healthcare and law, I think, are the only professions that still use fax machines. I think the NHS is like the only thing that's keeping the fax machine business in business. Um,
Yeah,
but
seems
yeah,
about right.
yeah, all those things are incredibly annoying and bad, and you need something to keep you in it. And maybe one of the things that keeps you in it is the sense of camaraderie you form when you haven't slept for 4 days and you've spent all those 4 days with one other guy, and you know it's almost always a guy, and you feel like you are in the trenches with them. And I think a lot of people look back very fondly on those times, even if they were miserable to experience. In fact, I know people look back very fondly on those times.
Well, I was going to say the thing that I think is pretty impressive, you know, as you mentioned, you're writing this book from a perspective of a historian who's not gone through residency and those things, but you kind of nailed that, because
Yeah.
we one of our earliest
Yeah.
episodes was on Dr. Stuart Halstead, and you know, the founder of our residency system, or the idea behind it, and you know, working for 1 billion hours in a week, and making that part of how physicians are trained, whether they're surgeons or general physicians. And the way I kind of saw it is surgeons do all that residency, and honestly, a lot of those high hour demands continue for them. And I'm somebody who I'm in your camp, I think, and I'm not speaking as a surgeon, but I do think that the extreme work hours, there has to be a better way. And residency is tough for all of us. And Aaron went through residency before I did. And by the time I was going through, we did start to have work hour restrictions, at least in the first year. You know, the
I
second
was
year,
right at the edge
not so
of
much, and
starting.
beyond. And I look at that time complicated, with a complicated lens, because it was very difficult, something that I don't think I could do twice in one life. I really don't think I would have the energy to do it, you know, a second time if I had to. But I do think that it was complicated, because as much as those work hours did wear on my body, my mind, and all of those around me were doing the same thing. And so I certainly bonded with everybody who was not only in my residency program, but we did rotations with surgeons. We had a very close relationship with our trauma surgery team at the hospital I trained. And I don't know if there's another way to do it. I like to believe there may be, but that it is. I'm not going to say it's exactly analogous to something as stressful as being in a wartime situation, but certainly that type of situation creates similarly very, very strong, deep bonds between people. The overall reason for being in that situation is awful, however. And so it raises a question of, do we need that? And it's I don't know, how fondly do you look at residency time there, Aaron?
Oh yeah, no, not fondly. I mean, I think it made me the practitioner I am, but I think what's great about the book is it gets to some of the underlying emotional, cultural, societal reasons why it persists. Because to me, the argument that you need more time in the operating room doesn't wash for a second. The extra hours that I spent in the hospital, I wasn't doing extra procedures. I was doing grunt work, or I was doing paperwork, or I was being available when other people didn't want to be available. And certainly there were, you know, learning opportunities and such that were present off hours. And there's also just the fact somebody has to be there overnight. I mean, that, you know, and so there are certain things that have to be covered, but I think, oh, you need more time in the operating room, and that's why we work 100. Well, no, assign people that are going into surgery to the cases and give them time in the operating room and give them time off afterwards. It seems completely reasonable. There's plenty of other people that don't necessarily want to be surgeons who could also help. But there is absolutely this huge other part of it, which again, you get to really well, which is there's all these other factors at play. And part of it is the camaraderie. Part of it is steeling yourself against sort of succumbing to the despair of dealing with people who are really sick at all hours, and sort of being, I guess, strong enough to do that well. So there is value to that. I had a different experience than Max. I had a family at the time I went through medical school and residency. So I would absolutely, as soon as I had even a sliver, I would just like scream out of the parking lot as fast as I could to get home. But still, there was a lot of time where I think we were just stuck together, and that does build camaraderie, but at what cost? And is there another way?
On that point too, you mentioned costs, right? And in one of the chapters in your book, it features heavily on certainly how this type of training for a surgeon affects people who aren't male, right, and who aren't
Right.
white male. Let's put
Yeah.
it that way. And with some real objective things, we talk about how this is hard on us, but I remember in one of the chapters addressing this, to be a female in surgery, there are some physical consequences, things like infertility, things like putting off having families later, and if you do have a family, trying to be there at all for them when you are working 80 to 100 plus hours a week. Can you talk about a few of the folks who you spoke with who shared some of those experiences, or kind of give us a little bit of input on those real truths, those real harms that can happen?
Absolutely. So I spoke to kind of two categories of women, I suppose. The women who stayed in surgery and who are still surgeons, or who did full careers in surgery and then retired, and then women who started out in surgery and who left. And that latter category is a very large cohort of people. There are lots of, medicine in the UK is roughly 50-50 now. Like they're about, in terms of men and women. And there are more female medical students than male. But there is when it comes to surgery, and surgery is improving. There are more women, female consultant surgeons in the UK than there have been, which is quite a minimal thing to say, but we've got to praise progress where we see it. But the leaky pipeline of surgery is incredible. Of women in surgery is quite significant, in that they start out, they do really well at medical school, they do really well in their foundation years, they decide they want to be surgeons, maybe they become surgeons for a few years, they start training programs, and then they realize that this is a profession that has not been designed with them in mind, and it's complicated because, of course, having families is something that both men and women do, and people do them in all sorts of configurations, in queer relationships, queer families. So it's not obviously just a problem for heterosexual women, but the nature of society as it is currently structured means that caring responsibilities of children still overwhelmingly falls on women. And so it becomes very clear, I think, and this is just one part of why the sort of quote unquote problem of women in surgery, but that it becomes very clear to a lot of women that they are going to have to perhaps either choose between being a surgeon or being a parent, or they're going to have to become a surgeon in a particular way, and it's going to be really hard work. And that's not to say it's going to be harder work necessarily than the kind of actual training process. They're also going to have to constantly advocate for themselves, constantly advocate for slightly different structures of work, constantly advocate for curtailing their own working hours, or convincing people that they are still excellent surgeons despite the fact that they have children at home. And there are some factors, as you said, Aaron, like, you do need people in hospital at all hours, right? Like, there are things about medicine that mean that it does have unsociable working hours often, sometimes. That's the reality of the way, people get sick all the time, at all hours of the day, basically. But there is no buffer in medicine that allows that people to work around those schedules, or to be able to, or there's very little buffer around that kind of, those sorts of constraints. And so I spoke to lots of women who were like, well, I wanted to be a surgeon, and it just proved impossible because I was going to have to choose between, and they come up against incredibly hostile and explicit obstacles, in that they have senior male surgeons in their team who say, oh, well, you can't have a baby, or if you want kids, go and work in general practice, or if you want kids, go be a pediatrician, which is not exactly a low workload.
I had people in medical school that I went to medical school with who were told those things explicitly during residency interviewing.
It happens.
It absolutely still happens.
All the time, yeah, constantly. I had one trainee surgeon told me that she had and it also comes from, very well-intentioned senior female surgeons who sit one surgeon said to me she was sat down in her office, or she sat down in the office with her female surgical mentor, who did a graph of her fertility and how it's going to drop off as she got into her 30s. It's like, if you want to have children, you're going to have to leave here. This is how you're going to, it's a whole, having to navigate that. And obviously people do it, and people do it with great success. But it is both practically very challenging and kind of culturally, the culture is relatively hostile to it. And so I did also speak to people who'd had children, female surgeons who'd had children and continue to be surgeons, and they talked about how difficult it was. I mean, I've got a 4-month-old baby. It's very difficult having a very small baby, and I'm not working. I mean, this is an exception, but this isn't really equivalent to performing surgery. But it's very difficult. But imagine doing that and also working these intense working hours. And people talk to me about how they had children who were failing to thrive, who were having really difficult behavioral issues because they were just never there. They could never be there. And the intense guilt and personal, even though it is not something you should feel guilty for, but navigating work and motherhood, speaking from a personal perspective, is very difficult, even if you don't have the kind of high intensity, hostile working environment, working kind of experience that you might have in surgery. And so I can only imagine how difficult it must be.
Well, and I think the good news here is that if you take all that into account, how difficult it is to raise a family as a female surgeon, and then enter into a hierarchy which has traditionally and historically been very male dominated, at least the expectations on you as that female surgeon are not excessively high compared to your male colleagues, correct? You're I'm speaking facetiously, of course.
Yeah,
because there is an expectation. Now you have to prove yourself at a different level. On top of all that, and something I certainly saw as a resident, not as a surgeon, resident in surgery, but and I see with female colleagues from my residency and from medical school, and so can you speak to that a little bit? So add that extra layer on.
It's tricky because I think, a lot of these problems we're talking about, it's perhaps clear by my own personal interjections, are problems of just the patriarchy, of just, being, that they aren't unique to surgery. They're not unique to medicine. Be that sort of need to prove yourself above and beyond your male colleagues is something that women feel in all sorts of industries and professions. And navigating parenthood, and obviously this is also a challenge for men. But these, the thing that I think is striking to me about surgery is that the numbers reveal it to be, even if you take away any kind of more sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Even more impressionistic. And even if you take away any kind of more impressionistic senses of what the culture of surgery might be like and why it might be different, which, I don't, as a cultural historian, I have no interest in doing. But even if you just look at the kind of cold, hard facts of how many women are in surgery as a profession, it's not only poor compared with other professions like law, academia, it's also poor compared with other medical specialties. So I don't think I think it's still the worst, at least it is in the UK, in terms of female representation in surgery compared with, say, other medical specialties. But even if it's not the worst, it's still pretty bad, right? And so we know that women aren't able to enter surgery, and they aren't able to stay in surgery in the numbers that we need them to be. And so I think that there is obviously something specific about surgery, or at least something specific about medicine, that makes these broad social issues, it crystallizes them, or it adds an extra layer to them that make it extra tough to succeed as a woman in surgery, which is not to say that women don't, and so many of them do, but they have to work extra hard to do so, and that shouldn't be the case.
It's not only difficult for women in surgery in that regard, but you also spend a good amount of time in the book talking about people from minority communities and how their journey into surgery, which is, as we've kind of historically set out here, a certain kind of male dominated, but also, very much white dominated field in a certain respect, how over the last 100 years or so. How can you speak to kind of how this has changed in some of the struggles that persons from minority communities, and you're speaking, this book is kind of more speaking from the perspective, a British perspective, but I will say there's a lot of parallel in a lot of the things that you speak about, from international medical graduates, graduates of different skin colors. That I would not be surprised if the numbers are very similar over here in the United
Well,
States.
the
So I
U.S.
think
is famously post-racial, and we've solved all those problems. So
I
think
forgot.
this
I forgot about that. That's what it's, and of course, yeah. But could you speak to that a little bit? You do a really good job with that in your book, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, just quickly on the kind of British American thing. I mean, for any listeners who are, in the US thinking, oh, this book is going to be no use to me because it's all about the UK. I will say, as you very kindly said, that the thing about medicine is that it was an incredibly successful export. And so one of the things that it has tried to do is replicate itself around the world. The kind of cultures, the sort of, and of course, there are going to be very big differences between surgery and, say, Britain and the US. But there are also powerful
huge
similarities. And I think culturally, and this is a cultural book or a book about culture, there's so much, they have so much in common. And even with the very big differences in kind of the way that we structure and finance our healthcare, those obviously will add different inflections to the different national cases. But I think that still, in terms of what it means to be a surgeon, I think they have so much in common. But in terms of and obviously, I think as you rightly point out, the US and the UK have very different histories of racism and of immigration. But again, there are commonalities. And I think that one of the things that I was interested in when writing this book is the intersections between class and race, and of course also race and gender. But one of the things that is, I think, a real engine for the perpetuation of the quite harmful myth of the modern surgeon is this old boys club, which is a phrase that is used all the time in conversations about surgery in the UK, and I imagine also in the US to a certain extent, which is both used approvingly and more in historically, but also as a kind of way of critiquing the way the surgery functions. And the old boys club is a bit like that kind of camaraderie, belonging, that kind of intense sort of homosocial relationship that these sort of working hours might engender. But also it's the socializing that goes along with surgery. So much of if you are a consultant in Britain in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you're going to spend a lot of time with your colleagues on the ward, but you're also going to spend a huge amount of time with them off the ward. You're going to go play golf with them. You're going to go grouse hunting with them. You're going to go on walking holidays.
We do that all the time in the US. Grouse hunting, one of our favorite pastimes.
Yeah, exactly. I bet you still play golf though. I bet there are plenty of
Americans
out on the golf course.
So much.
And
so much golf.
And they're going out for dinner, with their wives, and they're going out for dinners with their wives, and they're drinking Bordeaux, and they're going on like jolly trips to, tours to other hospitals in, Europe and Australia and North America. And they're building a kind of social life that is that kind of happens both on and off the ward. And they are then using that social life to shape the surgical profession, quite literally. So they're saying, well, you should go get a job. Oh, old chap, you're great. I love going to play golf with you. You should go and work with my friend at Edinburgh. He's a great old chap. He'll give you a job. You don't even have to interview. You could just go and get a job there. And that's quite literally how surgical hiring practices in the UK worked for most of the 20th century. And to a certain degree, although much less because of various, I think, very good reforms, there's a certain degree of that still persists. And one of the problems with this kind of old boys club, this sort of networking approach to the surgical career path, is that it is obviously very exclusionary. It's very sort of middle to upper class. I know that middle class means something very different in the US, but in the UK we mean sort of the kind of upper echelons of society. So there's that kind of class aspect of it. But there's also a ethnicity aspect of it, which is that these old chaps, these old boys are all white, and they are all born in Britain. And if you are an international medical graduate or someone who is, say, trained in India, for example, and moved over to the UK, you don't have access to that network. And so you're not going to be getting, nudged into a nice role at a nice teaching hospital in a nice city. If you're going to get a job at all, it might be, in the Shetland Isles. And I can only imagine how miserable it must be to move from Mumbai to, like, I don't know, the north of Scotland. It was just the shock
It's
of
probably
the climate.
different.
There's
I imagine it's different.
But I'm making light of something that is really quite serious, in that you have this incredibly exclusive and difficult to enter club, and it is, so it's not that there aren't people of colour who work in British surgery, and of course there are loads now, especially, who are incredibly prominent, successful, and medicine is a very diverse profession in lots of ways, in surgery included. But it's about the hierarchy within those professions, like who gets to be at the top of those pecking orders, who gets to be the, at all the really nice, cushy jobs at the big fancy hospitals, who gets to kind of get like sidelined into a post rather than having to go through protracted application processes. And I spoke to surgeons, mostly of Indian descent, who said that they went to interview after interview after interview unsuccessfully, just knowing that the person who got the job in their stead was the son of so and so's friend. And this is recent, this is the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. And that is something that has really shaped the way that the surgical profession kind of structures and functions even today. As I said, those things have lessened and loosened, but again, still some of the much of the expectations, the discrimination, that still exists.
Absolutely. And we saw, I would say, at least if I can lend a little, like the U.S. perspective is probably not far off. I mean, I trained alongside many international medical graduates, and a lot were from India, especially on my medicine rotation. And one of the incredible things was that there was even if there was a barrier, because at this institution I have in mind, a lot of the way that it works in the US, and I don't know if it's exactly the same in England, but a lot of international medical graduates, even if they were a practicing physician in India, let's say, they start over here. They come over, and if they want to move to the US and practice medicine here, they have to start over. I'll give you an example. In when I was a third-year medical student, so I am even less, this is when you first get your boots on the ground. You're following around a medicine team. This is at a big teaching institution. We were on what we call rounds, and that's when you're all standing around, you're talking about a patient, and the medical students, you're sitting there with your little white coat, and the residents have the longer coats and then you have your attending, which is the practicing physician who's overseeing everything in this hierarchy. And so the interns, who were the first year residents on the team, the three of them, they were all from India. And when we talked about the case, it was a complicated case, and a third-year medical student certainly doesn't know as much as a fourth-year medical student, and certainly not as much as an intern. But when these guys were discussing the case, I had a feeling of sheer terror, because the amount of information they knew off the top of their head about what we were talking about was staggering. And I'm sitting there going, well, in 2 years, I'm supposed to be at that level. This is I'll do what I can, but what I did not know at the time, and when I was speaking with these interns at side, one of them was a cardiologist in India for 6 to 8 years before moving to the US, and he had to start over as a medicine resident at year one, as if he just came out of medical school. The other two, one was an oncologist and one was a pediatrician. They were all doing medicine, but they had to come over, and there was still this barrier where even though they were incredible physicians, they had way more knowledge base than certainly I would have as an intern, because they had already been practicing. And it's not like human bodies are all that different when you go overseas, right? So, we have this in the US, we have a bit of a barrier there where it's, well, okay, we know you may be a cardiologist in India, but you're an international medical graduate, so you will start in our medicine system from year one, as if you just came from medical school. And so there's even a bit of that barrier, and it certainly is, whether you're from India, whether you're from Eastern Europe, or or from England, you still will start at that, but it still represents a barrier to somebody who's an other, not from where you're from. And so at least I certainly saw a bit of that there, and it was startling to me. It was kind of startling, and
A bit, yeah.
and
It's all
uh,
over still. Yeah.
absolutely, it's still a persisting thing, and that counted. If somebody was a surgeon in India coming here, you're starting over, and often you've been through one surgical residency elsewhere. Not a lot of people want to do that again, and I don't blame them. And so a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
they may switch their specialty because at least hey, I won't spend 5 to 8 years, depending on what you go into, doing this over again, and that's an incredible barrier as well.
Yeah, I think I wish our dialogue, which again, the value of this sort of cultural evaluation from me as a layperson looking at an expert in cultural history go through this is just how much the themes in the book inform what's actually happening in our society and all these layers that we often just ignore as if, well, because we're in the goldfish of our own culture and we don't perceive it as something that we can evaluate. I mean, it has a huge impact on all of us. And I love that aspect of the book that's like making discrete all these different elements that affect us. And I wish when we had discussions in our society about things like structural racism or things like that, be like, look, we're not trying to tell you that you're doing this. Like, just understand that these systems have these effects. And we can start there and talk about what to do next. But like the first step is to just recognize it. I mean, I think to me, it's everywhere. I mean, if you look at the system I'm in right now, the majority of higher paid specialists are white males, and you can see a demographic difference between them and that group of people who I guess would be consultants in the UK system, and the internal medicine doctors who do all the paperwork tend to have a much higher proportion of foreign medical graduates who are incredibly capable and fill a huge need. I mean, that's like not the issue. The issue is what's available to you. And then the converse, I mean, I happened to go into medicine when I was about 5 or 6 years older than your standard student, and I was a white male, and I already had gray hair because that started in high school. I can tell you, people were asking me what to do as a third-year medical student. They would turn to me and they would say, "What do you want to do, doctor?" And I'm like, no, not yet. You don't want my opinion. Like, I don't even know how to dose paracetamol. Like, I can't even tell you that I'm going to go get you somebody who actually knows what they're doing. And there was this assumption of competence that people gave me without any sort of validity. And I think that's the counter. The other side of this is like we ascribe all these assumptions to people, not because we're trying. People aren't overtly being like, oh, I think less of that person because they're from India or they have a different color of skin or they're not my gender. I mean, obviously there's overt racism and there's overt sexism and so on, but a lot of these assumptions just go under the radar. And I thought you did just a great job of unpacking all of those layers and a very balanced way of saying, look, this is, cultural analysis. You're not ascribing malice to any of this. Yeah, I thought it was very valuable, and it's always interesting to see your own culture sort of made obvious. And
Yep.
The House of Medicine is in this book. I think surgery. Again, Max and I have both made clear we're not surgeons, but we know a lot of them, and the same stereotypes have informed us. We have the same thoughts about, oh, this should be a calling. I should be committed to my work. I feel guilty about leaving my work. How dare I go take care of my kids? How dare I, want to leave the job? It's all these things that, anyway, I don't know. I went off on a tangent, so I apologize. But that's what the book brought up in me. I think it's just all those issues are very well discussed. So I loved it.
And to that point too, as we kind of wrap up our interview here, I was going to say I wanted to ask a little bit of maybe some of the positive changes that, as you got towards the end of your research, are things moving in the right direction in some places? Is there something? And I don't mean to bring that question up as everything is negative, or not at all. But I love a lot of our episodes when we talk about medical history. We end up in some very dark places in some of these previous stories, and so anytime I can find something that's a bit of brightness and a bit of an up note to end on, I always like to.
Good.
So I was just wondering, Agnes, did you come across some things in the research that maybe you can leave us with that things might be moving in the right direction? Or if they're not, let me know now.
Absolutely. I mean, I think pretty much in every category that we've been talking about, things are getting better. So, got more women, more people of color, a broader kind of social class background, all entering surgery. So that was there's definitely progress, even if that progress is slower than some of us, including myself, might like to see. And some of the institutions of surgery, at least in the UK, are taking, I think, increasingly seriously some of these problems. So the Royal College of Surgeons of England just did a big report on racism within surgery. And I think that's a really important step along in the right direction. And so definitely there's cause for celebration. But I think one of the things that's important to also note is that even if you look back at the 1950s, when the caricature, the myth of the modern surgeon was perhaps at his most robust, his most restrictive, and his most harmful, and at a time when society is less open, less accepting, even more white dominated, male dominated, etc., than it is today. Even then, there are so many people who were working as surgeons or working in the world of surgery who had more progressive, more open, more reflective visions of what surgery should be or could be, or what the myth of the surgeon could look like or should look like. And I think that that's important, both because as a historian, it's very important to me not to write or think in tedious teleologies where, just society, everything just always gets better. So I don't think that's an accurate way of thinking about the past or present, but also because I think it's encouraging for us to think that even when we are living in restrictive, harmful, hierarchical systems and structures that we might not have a huge amount of control over, it is still possible for individuals to take more expansive, progressive, open-hearted views on their work, their colleagues, their lives. And I think that's a cause for celebration. It's nice to think that, even in the depths of a 120-hour week, there's going to be like episodes of kindness and forgiveness and positivity.
Well said.
Well said indeed. Well, with that, we really appreciate you being here on the show, taking the time to speak with us about your book. There's so much more we did not get to because we couldn't. There's a lot to learn here. There's a lot to know, and we don't have the entire day to talk, unfortunately. So I very much appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your
wish
time.
You the best with this book.
Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Agnes Arnold-Forster for taking the time to be here to discuss her fascinating book. Again, it's called Cold Hard Steel, The Myth of the Modern Surgeon. There's a lot more to discover in there, so please go and check out the book. You can get to it by going through the links in our show notes or through our website. Again, we can't say enough nice things about the book because it's such an unique topic that I'm just really glad we had the opportunity to discuss. Aren't you, Aaron?
Here. Yeah, it's unlike anything we've really done before, but endlessly fascinating.
There you have it. So with that, we appreciate everyone listening, and we'd love to hear from all of you out there. If you'd like to check out our merchandise or provide feedback, we can be reached through our website, www.horrorhistorianspod.com. There you can send us messages. You can find links to our social media sites as well. We do work to respond to all those posts on our social media accounts. If you want to participate in the show, use our site to send us a medical history trivia question so that we can test Mike's innate knowledge, and even more so now, send us a question so you can be entered into the Artery Inc. giveaway that we mentioned earlier. You can either do that through the website, you can do it through our social media, and if you do stump Mike, you do win your own medical eponym. Basically, name something in medicine after you. It's a totally real thing. If you have time, please go and leave us a nice 5-star review on iTunes or whichever platform you choose. We really do appreciate that, and we actually do read them as well. So thank you for everyone who has taken the time to do that in the recent weeks. Until next time, the Horror Historians are signing out AMA. This is the intro and outro for episode 69.
Wait, really?
Yeah,
nice.
This is episode 69.
Oh, man.
Cold Hard Steel.
We have a nice guest. We can't make any jokes.
No, I know. I actually didn't realize this would be 69 because Mike was all sad about not being episode 69. Okay. Disclaimer.
Maybe we'll make some jokes afterwards. Next episode.
Of course.